Hey guys, it's your girl Samantha with Black Nation News, and today I wanted to talk about a news article that came out. And this article has come out another time with the UN saying this. I think back in 2016, and I know some people are like shutting it down because they're just like, well, the UN has said it before and America's ignored them before. But I think being repetitive, saying it over and over, not letting it die, because it's so obvious that African Americans should be getting reparations. So the UN came out, the UN Human Rights Chief calls for reparations over racism. Now, the other article that I saw a while back, it was just like saying like the UN says that the America should pay African Americans reparations. Let me see if I can find it. 1 second. Like the one from 20. Because people are like, oh, they said it before, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, but I think what's strong about it is the fact that they're saying it again. Like, they keep saying it, like, we're not going to let this die. So, like, the last time in 2016, it was a UN panel that said the U.S. owes reparations to African Americans. And I love how they're very specific. There's no people of color. There's no the minorities in America. None of that BS. They made it very clear. African Americans. And we know who they are. So let's go back here to the more current one that was recently just put out. And I'll go ahead and read this article real quick. And then I want to give my commentary on why I know that reparations is going to happen for African Americans in the form of money and land and transformative laws and so many other things. I'm going to explain to you guys why I know this is going to happen. So let me go ahead and read this. I'll go with NPR. I really like that source. So I'm going to go with them. So they say the UN Rights Chief says reparations are needed for people facing racism. See, I don't like how that's kind of like bland. So that's the first issue right there, though. But let's go ahead and keep reading. So it's Michelle Bachelet. I'm assuming she's French. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, shown here last year, is urging countries worldwide to do more to help end discrimination, violence, and systemic racism against people of African descent. So she went worldwide. Okay, so that's why she said it that way. But I like that she is saying people of African descent, even though I'm sure some, white people and everybody's going to all of a sudden be trying to bring up their black grandma, great grandma that they've been hiding in the closet for centuries. They're going to try to bring them up out of nowhere. But there has already been a study. There's already been information put out of how it would be determined in America. I don't know about other countries, but I do think that African diaspora can take a page from ADOS and study what we wrote down and follow our lead. That's why I definitely don't think it benefits Africans who are in America or people of African descent like Haitians, Trinidadians, Jamaicans, etc. It's not cute when you guys are trying to come for our reparations. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's not cute. You're not going to touch it. We're not going to allow it. And it makes you look bad. To keep the bridge open and don't burn, if you don't want to burn bridges with African Americans, because you don't, we're one of the most powerful black groups in the world, because our country that we built is the most powerful country in the world. So do not piss us off. I've seen too much. When ADOS first started with their movement, they really were taking off. The movement that was created by Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, I saw a little bit too much, non-African American people from other countries who were of African descent being real nasty. And that's why I'm the way I am now, because I used to be full-on African person, but I'd listened to Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore. I was like, okay, they do have a point. But then I saw like the people coming out the woodworks. That wasn't cute. It wasn't cute. I saw the word Akata. Didn't even know we had a word. They had a word for African Americans. It's like basically like the N word. So I keep it 100. Okay, so you're not gonna be disrespecting my tribe and then expecting me to turn the other cheek. We don't turn the other cheek. You should know that by now, baby. We don't turn the other cheek in here in America. The African Americans, we fight. We're fighters. So I personally feel like African Americans, we're loving people. We love our Africanness of us. That's why we're very proud to be called African Americans. Of course, you got some who probably don't want to recognize that side, and that's their problem. That's called self-hate. But you have people who, like me, I'm proud of my African heritage. I've done my DNA. I know where my country came from, where my country and my people are from on my mother's side. I'm proud of my DNA. And just like I used to tell white girls who were trying to be black and trying to say stuff about me, like, I don't need to prove nothing to anyone. I owe you nothing. So I don't have to prove to Becky or Beckisha, who's trying to get with black guys, that I'm black. Look at my skin, boo-boo. This ain't from no suntan. This ain't from no sitting in the sun all day. This is my natural, just melanated skin. And that goes the same for all peoples of African diaspora, people from Africa. I don't need to prove nothing to you. I don't need to prove nothing to you. I know I'm African. I'm proud of my African heritage. That's all that matters. Now, as far as reparations, I plan on investing in my motherland because that's my heritage. That's where I derive from. So just because we were kidnapped and brought over to America does not mean I'm just like, oh, my allegiance, I only pledge allegiance to America. Hell no. Hell no. And the one thing I want to say is, like, as I fall more into my identity, I find that I am proud of my African heritage and I'm proud of my American heritage because my ancestors built America. And let's not get it twisted. Like, America is the best country in the world. Okay, they racist as fuck, but they're still the most wealthy country, the most powerful army, military. We're killing it with the talent. Hip hop is the most popular music all over the globe. Like, we're very extremely influential. Everyone follows America. Let's be honest. Like, it's a leader of all the countries in the world. So my ancestors did the damn thing. They did that damn thing. Okay, and we're not even like the full we ain't even got that many African Americans here. It's like 13%. We've been like 13% forever, because you see that they stay on our necks trying to keep us down, trying to kill us any way they can. So big ups to my ancestors who came here. They did not want to be here. They didn't ask to fucking be here. They were treated like shit, and they still persevere. They still built the best fucking country in the world. Okay, so I'm never going to be like, oh, I'm not proud to be American. No, you damn right I'm proud to be American. And anybody that's hating on us because we raising our American flag along with the African flag, if you know which country you come from, our RBG flag, that's your problem, not mine. Because I find it real interesting. People come from all over to come to America, but then they looking crazy when we raise our flag like we're not supposed. I'm African American crazy. You know what I'm saying? Like, who the fuck are you to tell me I can't raise my flag? And I see everybody else who can barely speak English raising the American flag. They real happy to be American. We've been here since the beginning. We built the fucking country. Like, we were here since America was not even America yet. So what you talking about? Please go sit down. Sorry, y'all. I'm going on my rant because every time we had this conversation, you always get these African diaspora people or people from Africa trying to come in and get a check. Please go sit your ass down. If you want a check, take it up with your country. Just like this UN Commissioner for Human Rights said, you need to go to your country. Notice she said urging countries with an S, worldwide. Take your grievance to your country and go get your check. Why the fuck are people always riding on African Americans' coattails? We're tired of carrying everybody. That's another problem. Everybody's they hating on us because for once you got to carry your own fucking weight. Oh well. What does that say about you? That means that you've been lazy all this time. You just ride on our coattails. You already came over here, benefiting from affirmative action and all the things we fought for, moving us out the way, talking shit about us. Then you speaking for us, like, excuse me, what's that one dude, something Acho? Please go sit your ass down. You are not African American. Don't speak for me. So, yeah, it says urging countries worldwide. Urging countries. So you need to go to England. You need to go to Kenyan government. You need to go to whatever government, wherever you came from, Jamaica, wherever you came from, you need to go there and demand your reparations check. Just like we taking our claim to America because that's the only place we've ever been. Just because you came over here for like 2 minutes don't mean you get to be like, oh, I want to check it. Negative. Nope. And even if you say like, okay, I went through some racism also, that's fine. That's cute. That's fine. Just start your own claim, boo-boo. Okay, start your own claim. So you can be over there with your little claim, and we're going to be over here with our centuries of injustice. Okay, like we will not be having it. No random person. I don't care how much you look like me. We didn't move past that. African Americans, we are quick. We're quick learners. We've learned from the past that just because they look like us, all skin folk ain't kin folk. Okay. So let's keep reading. I'm gonna go ahead and finish reading this, and then I want to go ahead and explain to you guys why I believe. I'm not gonna say believe. I'm gonna bring it to the universe. God's looking out for us. I know we are the chosen, and God is going to make this happen for us. One, because it's justice for our ancestors, and two, it just makes sense. But the main reason, I'm going to explain that in a minute. So let me go ahead and finish reading this. So it says Geneva. The UN Human Rights Chief, in a landmark report launched after the killing of George Floyd in the United States, is urging countries worldwide to do more to help end discrimination, violence, and systemic racism against people of African descent and quote-unquote make amends to them, including through reparations. The report from Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, offers a sweeping look at the roots of centuries of mistreatment faced by Africans and people of African descent, notably from the transatlantic slave trade. It seeks a transformative approach to address its continued impact today. The report, a year in the making, hopes to build a momentum around the recent intensified scrutiny worldwide about the blight of racism and its impact on people of African descent, as epitomized by the high-profile killings of unarmed black people in the United States and elsewhere. There is today a momentous opportunity to achieve a turning point for racial equality and justice, the report said. The report aims to speed up action by countries to end racial injustice and impunity for rights violations by police, ensure that people of African descent and those who speak out against racism are heard, and face up to past wrongs through accountability and redress. I'm calling on all states to stop denying and start dismantling racism, to end impunity and build trust, to listen to the voices of people of African descent, and to confront past legacies and deliver redress, Bachelet says in a video statement. While broaching the issue of reparation in her most explicit way yet, Bachelet suggested that monetary compensation alone is not enough and will be part of an array of measures to help rectify or make up for the injustices. Reparations should not only be equated with financial compensation, she wrote, adding that it should include restitution, rehabilitation, acknowledgement of injustices, apologies, memorialization, educational reforms, and quote-unquote guarantees that such injustices won't ever happen again. The UN-backed Human Rights Council commissioned the report during a special session last year following the murder of Floyd, a black American who was killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis in May 2020. The officer, Derek Chauvin, was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison last week, which is not enough time, but let me keep reading. Protests erupted after excruciating bystander videos show how Floyd gasped repeatedly, "I can't breathe," as onlookers yelled at Chauvin to stop pressing his knee on Floyd's neck. The protests against Floyd's killing and the momentous verdict against Chauvin are a seminal point in the fight against racism, the report said. And that's probably the only reason why they sent his ass to jail, because now we have smartphones and we have the internet, and now everybody is watching. And America's been running their ass around trying to tell everybody else like about their human rights violations when they got the biggest human rights violations right here on their own soil. All right, so the report was based on discussions with more than 340 people, mostly of African descent, and experts, more than 100 contributions in writing, including from governments and review of public material, the Rights Office said. So this report was based on discussions with more than 340 people, mostly of African descent. So I really appreciate appreciate that for once they included us in the damn discussions. It's like, do not be having discussions about what we need for our redress without us at the table. That don't make no damn sense. So it analyzed 190 deaths, mostly in the U.S., to show how law enforcement officers are rarely held accountable for rights violations of crimes against people of African descent. And it noted similar patterns of mistreatment by police across many countries. The report ultimately aims to transform those opportunities into a more systemic response by governments to address racism, and not just in the United States. Although the injustices and legacy of slavery, racism, and violence faced by African Americans was clearly a major theme, because we, just like Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck, African Americans will not keep our knee off of the white supremacist fucking neck. We won't take our fucking boot off their goddamn neck. They can't breathe without us bringing up racism. I go to every closing, I talk about racism, white supremacy, everything I do. I can't get it out of my mouth fast enough. You gonna know about this. It's gonna be in your fucking face all day, every day. And this white lady once told me, oh, all these people protesting, they got us like feeling guilty. That's the point, crazy. We are no longer walking around trying to make you feel comfortable about you treating us like shit. What kind of fucked up shit is that? You damn right your ass should feel guilty. Cut them checks. So the report also laid out cases, concerns, and the situation in roughly 60 countries, including Belgium, Brazil, Britain, Canada, Colombia, and France, among others. We could not find a single example of a state that has fully reckoned with the past or comprehensively accounted for the impacts of the lives of people of African descent today. Boom. And that's what we see here in America. That everywhere you look, I realized once I became an adult, because they don't teach us in schools, y'all. Everywhere you look, we are being oppressed. People who look like me, African people, peoples of African descent, African diaspora, we're the lowest. We're looking crazy. We're struggling. We're in poverty. We way at the bottom. Our countries that we are the majority in are doing the worst. Why is that? And then you got these crazy people, these like non-black people coming into our countries and taking the resources out of it, especially in our motherland, Africa. Like that definitely got to stop. Absolutely not. And I've seen like Malema. I really like him. I've seen some of the African presidents trying to say, or saying like, this is not going to happen anymore in my country. All 50 countries in Africa need to denounce. Is it 50 countries or 54? I think it's 54 countries. But all of the African countries need to denounce anybody who ain't from that country should not be coming in that country, taking all the resources out and taking it to their own country. How the fuck does that make sense? Like, even America has frozen China's assets as far as like the land that they have in America. They have like a lot of farmland in America. And it's like, why do you own so much farmland in our country? We couldn't go over to China and buy up all your damn land. Stay your ass over in your country. You know what I'm saying? And we just trade our goods and keep it moving. Like, shit's no. And this is COVID. COVID has opened up the floodgates, y'all. Like, and it ain't gonna end here because we already got some other variants going on. Like, and I've already heard experts say that will not be the last pandemic. COVID has brought this world to its knees. And I have never been happier watching Babylon fall. Might I say that? Because I'm about to make a video about that next. But I am enjoying every bit of watching America just collapse. And y'all might be saying, oh, you don't want America to collapse, then you going to be doing whatever. You know what I'm saying? I can't be doing no worse than what I'm doing. Shit. Because right now, okay, I'll send to y'all later when I'm done with this article because it'll wrap it all together. So let me keep going. So Rona Rishmawi, who leads a unit on non-discrimination at the UN Human Rights Office, told a news conference, "Our message, therefore, is that this situation is untenable. Compensation should be considered at the collective and the individual level," she said, while adding that any such process starts with acknowledgement of past wrongs and is not one size fits all. She said countries must look at their own past and practices to assess how to proceed. Now, y'all need to pay attention to that. Africans, people of African diaspora who come to America, your countries need to look at their own past indiscretions, like their own past bad behavior, and their practices to assess how to proceed. Because African Americans would not be in your countries looking for a reparations check. We would know that our justice claim is back in America, even if we were living in Jamaica for 50 some years, or we were in Ghana for 100 years. Why the hell would we be entitled to any money in Ghana or any other country that we didn't help build? So the UN report called on countries to make quote-unquote amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, such as through quote-unquote formal acknowledgement and apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. I'm glad they mentioned truth-telling processes, because I really do feel like that definitely needs to be part of the reparations package, is teaching critical race theory, the true history of what happened in each of these countries, because my country, America, didn't teach us shit. So a lot of people that come over here, they like, why are black people like so lazy? They have no clue the culture here. They think they know it from TV. We're not a fucking TV show. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you don't know what's really going on here. And now that we have smartphones and we can put up on the internet, people are finally seeing that black people in America, we've never been free. We have had a knee and a boot on our neck since forever, since we came here in chains. We have never been free in America. So it also decried the dehumanization of people of African descent that was rooted in false social constructions of race in the past to justify enslavement, racial stereotypes, and harmful practices, as well as tolerance for racial discrimination, inequality, and violence. It cited inequalities faced by people of African descent and the stark socioeconomic and political marginalization they face in many countries, including unfair access to education, healthcare, jobs, housing, and clean water. So I'm going to explain to you now why reparations will be happening for African Americans, and it will behoove other countries to do the same for everyone, all their people of African descent all over the world. Love reading this article. So the cost of racism, and again, another NPR.org article. U.S. economy has lost $16 trillion because of discrimination, bank says. So Citigroup estimates the U.S. economy lost $16 trillion over the past 20 years as a result of discrimination against African Americans. And they just want the flag up there. So nationwide protests have cast a spotlight on racism and inequality in the United States. Now, our major bank has put a price tag on how much the economy has lost as a result of discrimination against African Americans. $16 trillion. Since 2000, U.S. gross domestic product, also known as GDP, lost that much as a result of discriminatory practices in a range of areas, including in education and access to business loans, according to a new study by Citigroup. It's not an insignificant number. By comparison, U.S. GDP totaled $19.5 trillion last year. And not acting to reverse discriminatory practices will continue to exact a cost. Citigroup estimates the economy will see a $5 trillion boost over the next 5 years if the U.S. were to tackle key areas of discrimination against African Americans. We believe we have a responsibility to address current events and to frame them with an economic lens in order to highlight the real cost of longstanding discrimination against minority groups, especially against black people and particularly in the U.S., wrote Raymond J. McGhee, a vice chairman at the bank and the chairman of its banking, capital markets, and advisory team. Wall Street itself has also faced accusations for years of discriminatory practices against African Americans, such as limiting approval for mortgages or not providing enough banking options in minority neighborhoods, which are among the damaging actions identified by Citigroup researchers. Specifically, the study came up with $16 trillion in lost GDP by noting 4 key racial gaps between African Americans and whites. $13 trillion lost in potential business revenue because of discriminatory lending to African American entrepreneurs, with an estimated 6.1 million jobs not generated as a result. So basically that's saying if we can't get capital from banks, they don't loan money to black Americans or African Americans, we cannot create jobs from for people. So you have all these people that are unemployed that would not be unemployed, and they would also be making money, which means they'll be spending money in the economy. I can't even talk about it because shit just makes me like pissed off that I live in a country that hates my race and me so much that you're willing to lose this much money just to keep being an asshole and I guess feeling quote unquote superior or the upper class of my race. When we all know that African Americans built the country, we're the most talented group in the country. Everything that America has is because of African Americans. If we were to leave America tomorrow, this raggedy ass country would fucking collapse because it's already collapsing. It would just be done. That's why you have not seen them send us back to Africa, have you? They always somehow, oh, you don't like America, go back to your own country. Where's my ticket? Okay, like if you really want me to go to Africa, cut me a check and give me a ticket. I'm out of here. Because y'all show us hell broke your neck coming way over to Africa to come get us. They haven't done any of that because they know they still need us. We don't need them. So $2.7 trillion in income lost because of disparities in wages suffered by African Americans. So they're saying because our wages are usually a lot lower. I think black women get like 30 some cents on the dollar to every what white man makes or something. It's like really low. Then you have $218 billion lost over the past 2 decades because of discrimination in providing housing credit. I'm not sure what they mean by housing credit, but like I don't know if that's welfare or maybe they mean being able to access loans to purchase homes. And then you have $90 billion to $113 billion in lifetime income loss from discrimination accessing higher education. So basically, if we can't access higher education, of course, we can't get the good jobs that pay a lot of money. And then if you can't get the good jobs to pay a lot of money, you can't buy a home, take care of your family properly. You're going to be living on welfare and socialist programs. You can't put money back into the economy because you ain't got that money. The shit rolls downhill. So let me keep going. As a result, Citigroup urges a slew of actions to reverse discriminatory practices and boost GDP over the next 5 years, including addressing the wage gap suffered by African Americans and promoting diversity at the top within banks and companies, and cutting some checks. We want some reparations. Citigroup, because I'm a promise to God, I already know Citigroup has most likely been built off of my ancestors' back. Okay? Citigroup's recommendations aren't new. Various studies have shown similar findings, and experts have called for similar action for years, though so far progress has been slow.
Fresh Air. I'm Dave Davies, and today for Terry Gross. Our guest today, Heather McGhee, has a new book about the importance of recognizing and fighting racism in America. But it isn't just an argument that racial discrimination is morally wrong and unfair, even deadly to people of color. The heart of McGhee's case is that racism is harmful to everyone, and thus we all have an interest in fighting it. Drawing on a wealth of economic data, she argues that when laws and practices have discriminated against African Americans, whites have also been harmed. When people unite across racial and ethnic lines, she argues, there's a solidarity dividend that helps everyone. Heather McGhee is the former president of the progressive think tank Demos, where she spent much of her career. She holds a BA in American Studies from Yale and a law degree from the University of California, Berkeley. She currently chairs the board of Color of Change, a nationwide online racial justice organization. Her new book is The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. She joins me from her home in Brooklyn, New York. Heather McGhee, welcome to Fresh Air.
I'm so glad to be with you.
You worked at the think tank Demos for a long time. Then you went and got a law degree and came back to it. And you write in the introduction that you were in love with the idea that information in the right hands was power. You would do research, you would craft legislation, you'd talk to members of Congress and their staffs hoping to make change. And you write that getting to some of the ideas that motivated this book came from your discovering the limits of research and facts. Just share with us that journey.
Well, I have always been animated by core questions about our economic dysfunction in America, why it was that people so often struggled just to make ends meet. I was born on the south side of Chicago. I saw what happened when the good factory jobs and the good public sector jobs started to leave. And it felt like we could do something about this. We could in many ways have nice things, right? Universal childcare and healthcare and reliable infrastructure and well-funded schools in every neighborhood. And the data was saying it would be in our economic interest to do it. So I did spend about 15 years in economic policy trying to make the case for better economic decisions. But ultimately, and I started having a hunch that I was sort of using the wrong tool. And I think the election of Donald Trump really, with the majority of white voters, to me was a wake-up call. And I decided that ultimately the facts and figures and reliance on a sense of economic self-interest was not actually going to be enough. I had to get at some deeper questions in this country. It wasn't that I had the wrong numbers. It was that I had the wrong, deeper story about status and belonging, about competition, about deservingness, questions that in America have always turned on race.
Right. You write in here that when we ask people their opinions about, racially neutral policy proposals, or at least theoretically neutral proposals like raising the minimum wage or expanding public health care alternatives or even action to prevent climate change, people's opinions were affected by whether they thought that the demographic changes in the United States threatened the status of white people. That seemed to change the way people viewed everything. This was sort of an important realization, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it's a really astonishing set of data. The psychologists Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson did this study, and then there's been a whole host of other ones to basically show that there is a predominant zero-sum mindset that's predominant among white Americans more than among Americans of color, that basically is threatened by the idea of demographic change, that on a gut level feels like that is not in their own interest, and that makes them want to pull away from some kinds of policies that are actually, you would think, in their economic interest, right? The majority of people making under $15 an hour are white. The majority of people without health care are white. We all live under the same sky and are all going to be vulnerable to climate change. And yet, making race salient, as of course Donald Trump did and Trumpism does, makes white people more conservative. It's this zero-sum idea that progress for people of color has to come at white people's expense.
Well, you take us through some fascinating historical turns on how racism, discrimination, even slavery obviously was harmful to the enslaved and victims of racism, but also harmed white people. And you write about a fascinating book published in 1857, when slavery was still in effect in the South. And this book was by a white racist Southerner named Hinton Rowan Helper, who looked at the effect of slavery on white people in the South. What story did he tell? So I myself am the descendant of enslaved people, and so I am going to be the last person to minimize the sheer brutality and dehumanizing force that was American chattel slavery. And yet at the time of the debates about abolition among white Americans, one of the most powerful voices was a white Southerner who was an avowed racist. And he wrote a book that basically said that slavery was benefiting the plantation class, but it wasn't benefiting the white majority in the South. And he saw that it was shortchanging the public development of the infrastructure in Southern states. He compared the number of schools, libraries, and other public institutions that had been set up in free states versus slave states. In Pennsylvania, he counted 393 public libraries. In South Carolina, just 26. In Maine, not a very populous state, 236 libraries. In Georgia, just 38. And the tally was similar everywhere he looked. So I read Helper's book. I also read some studies about how today we know that many of the poorest places in America are in the South. But what's interesting about it is we can draw a connection between the disinvestment in the original sort of founding centuries of America and the disinvestment during Jim Crow, where you really had an unwillingness among the elite to,
build schools in every neighborhood, to create robust public infrastructure everywhere. And that is relating to poverty today, not just among Black people, but among white people as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating correlation. And, I guess one might argue that, well, the South was an agrarian economy. It simply generates, less in the way of economic productivity. And so that's might be part of the answer. What was it that prevented the planter class from providing libraries and schools to the white people?
They didn't need to. I mean, really, the reason why wealthy people invest in the communities around them is because they need to make the community livable for themselves, but also to attract and retain the people on whom their profits depend, whether it's workers or customers. But in the slave economy, neither was strictly necessary, right? So the source of plantation wealth was a completely captive and unpaid labor force. Owners didn't need more than a handful of white workers per plantation, and they didn't need or want an educated populace, whether Black or white. And their farms didn't depend on local customers, right? The factories were in the north, and the markets were, in fact, even global. And so there was just a sense that it was a contained system, and it wasn't necessary to invest in the public good outside of that system.
You also explore the days when, as there were efforts to introduce integration in parts of the South, that local elites, in order to maintain racial segregation, effectively cut off a lot of public investment, specifically the battle over swimming pools. You want to describe that?
Yeah, this to me is really the kind of parable at the heart of the book. It's what's illustrated on the cover. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the United States went on a building boom of these grand resort-style swimming pools. These were the kinds that would hold hundreds, even thousands of swimmers. And it was a real sort of Americanization project. It was to create a bath temperature melting pot of, white ethnic immigrants and people in the community to come together. It was sort of a commitment by the government to a leisure-filled American dream standard of living. And in many of these public pools, the rule was that it was whites only, either officially or unofficially. And in the 1950s and 60s, when Black communities began to understandably say, hey, it's our tax dollars that are helping to support this public good, we need to be allowed to swim too, all over the country, particularly in the American South, but in other places as well. White towns facing integration orders from the courts decided to drain their public swimming pools rather than let Black families swim too. Now, I went to Montgomery, Alabama, where there used to be one of those grand resort-style pools, and where, effective January 1st, 1959, not only did they back a truck up and pour dirt into the pool and pave it over, but they also sold off the animals in the municipal zoo. They closed down the entire Parks and Recreation Department of Montgomery for a decade. It wasn't until almost 1970 that they reopened the park system for the entire city. And I walked the grounds of Oak Park. Even after they reopened it, they never rebuilt the pool. And that to me felt like this just tangible symbol of the way that a population taught to distrust and disdain their neighbors of color will withdraw from public goods when they no longer see the public as good.
So the result was that in those communities, you'd had, the elites had private clubs and private pools, but poor and working people of all races simply didn't have the public amenities. They were gone.
That's exactly right. You started to see suburban backyard pools and these membership-only swimming clubs. In Washington, D.C., you saw over 100 new membership-only swimming clubs after you had pool integration. It's a small thing, and yet I began to see examples of the drained pool everywhere in the way we withdrew from funding public education, in our inability to win universal health care, in the way that we have not innovated around the kinds of public resources that we all need, whether it's universal childcare or broadband or high-speed rail. We've withdrawn from the sense of what we could do together in the wake of integration.
You tell a story of how the U.S. government took a lot of steps in the mid-20th century to create a middle class, effectively a white middle class. Let's talk about this. One of the tools was the GI Bill, which provided assistance for education and home financing for returning military personnel after World War II. A lot of returning GIs, but this was not race neutral in its implementation, was it?
No, it wasn't. Like so much of the system, of the social contract that really created the middle class in the middle of the 20th century, it ended in many ways have nice things, right? Universal child care and health care and reliable infrastructure and well-funded schools in every neighborhood. And the data was saying it would be in our economic interest to do it. So I did spend about 15 years in economic policy trying to make the case for better economic decisions. But ultimately, and I started having a hunch that I was sort of using the wrong tool. And I think the election of Donald Trump really, with the majority of white voters, to me was a wake-up call. And I decided that ultimately the facts and figures and reliance on a sense of economic self-interest was not actually going to be enough. I had to get at some deeper questions in this country. It wasn't that I had the wrong numbers. It was that I had the wrong, deeper story about status and belonging, about competition, about deservingness, questions that in America have always turned on race.
Right. You write in here that when we ask people their opinions about, racially neutral policy proposals, or at least theoretically neutral proposals like raising the minimum wage or expanding public health care alternatives or even action to prevent climate change, people's opinions were affected by whether they thought that the demographic changes in the United States threatened the status of white people. That seemed to change the way people viewed everything. This was sort of an important realization, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it's a really astonishing set of data. The psychologists Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson did this study, and then there's been a whole host of other ones to basically show that there is a predominant zero-sum mindset that's predominant among white Americans more than among Americans of color, that basically is threatened by the idea of demographic change, that on a gut level feels like that is not in their own interest, and that makes them want to pull away from some kinds of policies that are actually, you would think, in their economic interest, right? The majority of people making under $15 an hour are white. The majority of people without health care are white. We all live under the same sky and are all going to be vulnerable to climate change. And yet, making race salient, as of course Donald Trump did and Trumpism does, makes white people more conservative. It's this zero-sum idea that progress for people of color has to come at white people's expense.
Well, you take us through some fascinating historical turns on how racism, discrimination, even slavery obviously was harmful to the enslaved and victims of racism, but also harmed white people. And you write about a fascinating book published in 1857, when slavery was still in effect in the South. And this book was by a white racist Southerner named Hinton Rowan Helper, who looked at the effect of slavery on white people in the South. What story did he tell? So I myself am the descendant of enslaved people, and so I am going to be the last person to minimize the sheer brutality and dehumanizing force that was American chattel slavery. And yet at the time of the debates about abolition among white Americans, one of the most powerful voices was a white Southerner who was an avowed racist. And he wrote a book that basically said that slavery was benefiting the plantation class, but it wasn't benefiting the white majority in the South. And he saw that it was shortchanging the public development of the infrastructure in Southern states. He compared the number of schools, libraries, and other public institutions that had been set up in free states versus slave states. In Pennsylvania, he counted 393 public libraries. In South Carolina, just 26. In Maine, not a very populous state, 236 libraries. In Georgia, just 38. And this
the tally was similar everywhere he looked. So I read Helper's book. I also read some studies about how today we know that many of the poorest places in America are in the South. But what's interesting about it is we can draw a connection between the disinvestment in the original sort of founding centuries of America and the disinvestment during Jim Crow, where you really had an unwillingness among the elite to, build schools in every neighborhood, to create robust public infrastructure everywhere. And that is relating to poverty today, not just among Black people, but among white people as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating correlation. And I guess one might argue that, the South was an agrarian economy. It simply generates, less in the way of economic productivity. And so that might be part of the answer. What was it that prevented the planter class from providing libraries and schools to the white people?
They didn't need to. I mean, really, the reason why wealthy people invest in the communities around them is because they need to make the community livable for themselves, but also to attract and retain the people on whom their profits depend, whether it's workers or customers. But in the slave economy, neither was strictly necessary, right? So the source of plantation wealth was a completely captive and unpaid labor force. Owners didn't need more than a handful of white workers per plantation, and they didn't need or want an educated populace, whether Black or white. And their farms didn't depend on local customers, right? The factories were in the north, and the markets were, in fact, even global. And so there was just a sense that it was a contained system, and it wasn't necessary to invest in the public good outside of that system.
You also explore the days when, as there were efforts to introduce integration in parts of the South, that local elites, in order to maintain racial segregation, effectively cut off a lot of public investment, specifically the battle over swimming pools. You want to describe that?
Yeah, this to me is really the kind of parable at the heart of the book. It's what's illustrated on the cover. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the United States went on a building boom of these grand resort-style swimming pools. These were the kinds that would hold hundreds, even thousands of swimmers. And it was a real sort of Americanization project. It was to create a bath temperature melting pot of, white ethnic immigrants and people in the community to come together. It was sort of a commitment by the government to a leisure-filled American dream standard of living. And in many of these public pools, the rule was that it was whites only, either officially or unofficially. And in the 1950s and 60s, when Black communities began to understandably say, hey, it's our tax dollars that are helping to support this public good, we need to be allowed to swim too, all over the country, particularly in the American South, but in other places as well. White towns facing integration orders from the courts decided to drain their public swimming pools rather than let Black families swim too. Now, I went to Montgomery, Alabama, where there used to be one of those grand resort-style pools, and where, effective January 1st, 1959, not only did they back a truck up and pour dirt into the pool and pave it over, but they also sold off the animals in the municipal zoo. They closed down the entire Parks and Recreation Department of Montgomery for a decade. It wasn't until almost 1970 that they reopened the park system for the entire city. And I walked the grounds of Oak Park. Even after they reopened it, they never rebuilt the pool. And that to me felt like this just tangible symbol of the way that a population taught to distrust and disdain their neighbors of color will withdraw from public goods when they no longer see the public as good.
So the result was that in those communities, you'd had, the elites had private clubs and private pools, but poor and working people of all races simply didn't have the public amenities. They were gone.
That's exactly right. You started to see suburban backyard pools and these membership-only swimming clubs. In Washington, D.C., you saw over 100 new membership-only swimming clubs after you had pool integration. It's a small thing, and yet I began to see examples of the drained pool everywhere in the way we withdrew from funding public education, in our inability to win universal health care, in the way that we have not innovated around the kinds of public resources that we all need, whether it's universal childcare or broadband or high-speed rail. We've withdrawn from the sense of what we could do together in the wake of integration.
You tell a story of how the U.S. government took a lot of steps in the mid-20th century to create a middle class, effectively a white middle class. Let's talk about this. One of the tools was the GI Bill, which provided assistance for education and home financing for returning military personnel after World War II. A lot of returning GIs, but this was not race neutral in its implementation, was it?
No, it wasn't. Like so much of the system, of the social contract that really created the middle class in the middle of the 20th century, it ended up being filtered through racial segregation. It ended up being devolved down to local administration, which meant that Black GIs, even though they tried to take advantage of the benefits, were, shunted off to vocational schools because they were not allowed in the South to go to the mainstream, land-grant colleges. It meant that the, in many ways, most significant piece, the Veterans Administration home loan benefit, was completely denied to Black service members' families because the Veterans Administration adopted the, at that point, 2-generation-old practice of redlining, drawing lines, which is what the federal government did, around Black neighborhoods and saying, these are risky. Just because it's Black people, these are risky, and so we're not going to backstop any loans that banks might give to communities in this neighborhood.
Right. So this had an important generational effect, right? Because those GIs coming back and their families benefited from education and investments in homes, which, built up, some assets for those families. Black Americans were really left behind, and over the generations, that made a huge difference, didn't it?
There's something so powerful about wealth, and the word wealth connotes, diamonds and yachts, but we're really talking about a little bit of home equity, the fact that you grew up in a house that your parents owned, even if it was not a very expensive house, the fact that your aunt or uncle may have had some GM stock or a CD that they gave you, when you turned 18. It's this kind of intergenerational wealth, which was really created by public policy that, from the New Deal through the Civil Rights Movement, was explicit about wanting to create middle-class security, and just as explicit often about wanting to make sure that the benefits of that went to white people only, with racial covenants, for example. The federal government created suburbs by investing in the highway system and subsidizing private housing developers, but demanded whites-only clauses in housing contracts to prevent Black people from buying into them. Social Security excluded the job categories that left most Black workers out. You can even consider the New Deal labor laws that encouraged collective bargaining to be a government subsidy to create a white middle class, because many unions kept their doors closed to people who weren't white until the 1960s. And so you had this sort of big social contract. And that's really what we see. It's not just a drained pool and this nice-to-have recreational facility. It's the kinds of policies that shifted dramatically in the late 1960s, 70s, and early 80s to bring us the inequality era. And that's where we are today.
There was also a major public investment in public colleges and universities and community colleges, right, which made it cheaper for a lot of people to go to school. I mean, I went to school in the 70s at the University of Texas, and the tuition was low, and my family couldn't afford to send me any other way. Well, they didn't send me at all. It worked my way through it, but that was possible. It was doable. That was when most college students were white. Over time, that changes, and then we see a different attitude towards the public investment, right?
It's really one of those issues that I felt it was important to include in the book. back when the public was 90% white and the students who were going on to college were mostly white and actually mostly male, government picked up the tab, whether it was state governments funding the costs of their public colleges, like where you went, the University of Texas. And that was roughly about $6 out of $10 would come from the states. And then the rest translated into tuition bills, which often a federal grant, whether it was a GI or the Pell Grant, which was much more generous 2 generations ago, would pick up the rest. And so you really could get a minimum wage job over the summer and work your way through college. At Demos, we once did a report showing where every member of Congress went to college and what it cost then and what it costs now, just to remind the decision makers, most of them white, that there's something drastic that changed. And it's not that young people became less industrious or less willing to sacrifice. It's that government walked away from the deal, and it really was around the same time that the college-going population became more diverse and that this conservative anti-government ethos kicked in our politics. And that has a lot to do, the social science is now very clear, with these racialized ideas of who is the public and what they deserve. And so you started to see this privatization of public colleges. So now the majority of states rely on tuition dollars for the majority of the costs of college. And we shifted at the federal level from grants to loans.
Tuition is higher, student debt is far more burdensome. And I think the critical point here is that when this change was made, it affected more white students than black students in the end, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, 63% of white students have to borrow now, right? This is the majority of white students are caught in this new system, which is just no way to run a country, right? We know that student debt is delaying home ownership, even marriage. It's making it harder for graduates with debt to save for retirement. And of course, I want to be clear about this. Like every aspect of systemic racism, it hits the target first and worst. Black students, because of the intergenerational racial wealth divide that we talked about, have to borrow more in order to go to college, come out owing more. And then because of discrimination in the labor market, end up having a harder time paying it back and therefore end up paying more. But the majority of white students are also in debt. This is the way I think that systemic racism works in an interconnected society. It hits the target and it also distorts economic policy decision-making for everyone.
So we were talking about how government policy created a middle class in the mid-years of the 20th century, and it was essentially a white middle class because there were exclusions for African Americans, assistance to home ownership and college education, retirement security, etc. It changes kind of in the 70s, and we do know that in the 60s there was civil rights legislation. Some barriers came down. There was the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Is there a connection here between the growth of the civil rights movement and the assault on some of these racial barriers and the demonization of government among conservatives?
There is, Dave, and I really wanted to untangle this knot because as someone who spent a career in politics and policy where really the specter of the white moderate, right, the typical white moderate in the center that we have to sort of hew towards, it's always trimmed the sails of policy ambition, right? We can't get too far out of the center, and the center is defined as the sort of white, center, right, moderate. But I was shocked to learn that in the 50s, the majority of white people believed in an activist government in a way that is even more radical than today's average liberal. According to a really authoritative every 4-year survey, 65% of white people in 1956 thought the government ought to guarantee a job to anyone who wanted one and provide a minimum standard of living in the country. And then between 1960 and 1964, white support for these big government guarantees for everybody cratered. Went from nearly 70% to 35%, and it stayed low ever since. The black support for these kinds of guarantees has stayed high throughout the data set. So I wanted to know what happened. Was this like a fluke in the data? I mean, it was just such a dramatic shift. So it turns out that, what happened between 60 and 64? What happened is that you saw white Americans watch the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. They saw black activists actually demanding those same kinds of economic guarantees. That was part of the set of demands. You saw Kennedy start to speak about civil rights and make promises on civil rights. And then, just a few years later, when Johnson signed the civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he knew, he said that this was when he was going to sign away, the South by signing these bills. But I'm paraphrasing politically. But what he didn't know was that he was going to sign away the entire white vote for the rest of history, including the last election, right? That was the last election in which a majority of white people voted for what had suddenly become the party of civil rights.
One of the points you're making in the book is that racism hurts everybody. And when whites and blacks, or whites and people of color, manage to work together, it's better for everybody. And in fact, reducing discrimination should yield benefits for everybody. And so taking us back to those years in the 60s when, for example, the Voting Rights Act, which really did open up voter registration to a lot of places in the South where it had been closed off by poll taxes and literacy tests, et cetera. Was there a benefit for working class and middle class whites in those states where there was a different kind of racial balance in the voting population?
I mean, this is the thing, right? It's this zero-sum idea that progress for people of color has to come at the expense of white people, but that zero-sum idea is a lie. It's a lie that has been aggressively sold, I believe, to white Americans by people who are very vested in the economic status quo and in keeping the concentration of wealth and power very narrowly held. And so you really see that in Southern politics, what V.O. Key called the sort of, stranglehold of the plantation politics, where it was sort of one-party rule. And politicians before integration in the South didn't really have to appeal to a broad base about, with promises of a better quality of life. They could just sort of market white supremacy and say, defensively, vote for us because we're going to keep the racial order. And so when the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act got rid of things like the poll tax, you actually saw a resurgence of civic life in the South that impacted and freed up poor white people as well.
So there you saw more public investment in schools, perhaps, and libraries and roads and the kinds of things that improve lives.
Exactly. So what you started to see was, instead of running on white supremacy, right, and running on segregation, candidates had to run on things that would actually benefit people's lives to get their votes, right? I tell the story of Governor Albert Brewer, who ended up facing off George Wallace. But it was a race where he tried to put together a sort of new fusion coalition that was going to be the white middle class, newly enfranchised black Alabamians, and working class whites outside of the kind of black belt. And in order to sort of give the promise of what this new politics could be, he called a special session on education and passed 29 bills to say that, we actually need to educate our people. Because pre-civil rights Alabama was a place where, about half of the state's citizens had no more than an elementary school education, right? It was a place where the inequality and racism really had drained the pool. And so you started to see these big investments, things like universal kindergarten in these states in the South, because politicians had to actually compete for black people's votes and for white people's votes on issues other than just segregation. And you started to see people realize, actually, there are these things that unite us. We all want good education for our kids.
When we saw the Reagan Revolution happening in the 1980s, you saw conservatives embracing deregulation for businesses, generally suspicious of government, regarding as inefficient and unresponsive. Reagan saying the words you never want to hear are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And it was an effective sales pitch. And of course, one way of looking at it is that for elites, for economic elites, for wealthy individuals and corporations. They want to cut taxes, and to cut taxes, what you want to do is cut the size of government. So there's a fit there, and it's not necessarily per se a racist idea. However, when you're selling it, it seems, I mean, it was very convenient to make the beneficiaries of a bigger government welfare moms, people in the inner city. And so there ended up being a distinctly racial appeal to the political pitch, wasn't there?
There was. And, it's often subtle, although, of course, in recent times it hasn't been very subtle at all. But, there's that famous Lee Atwater quote from towards the end of his life where he really just lays it out. He explains how you go from explicitly racial appeals in the 1950s, and then it's starting to backfire because the civil rights movement has been effective, right? You don't actually want to call people the N-word. You don't actually want to make your political case for segregation and Jim Crow. And so then it becomes more subtle. You say, in his words, stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting abstract. Now, he says, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. He says, we want to cut this is much more abstract than the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than, he says, the N-word, right? It's this idea that once the government sort of moves in a really incredibly short period of time from the enforcer of the racial hierarchy, right? The one drawing the redlining maps, the entity that is creating the laws to segregate, to, in a very short time, that government moves from the enforcer of racial hierarchy to the upender. It's a core betrayal. And what the right was able to do was say, the government's no longer on your side. It's on the side of these undeserving people of color, these people you've been taught to distrust and disdain. And so you should trust the market, right? Turn to the market, turn to individualism, turn to the wealthy for your, sense of identity and trust and your sense of how you're going to succeed in life, right? It's no longer going to be New Deal universal benefits. It's going to be the market. And that was Reagan's story. And that zero-sum idea that undergirds it is really still so animating in the right-wing language around makers and takers and taxpayers and freeloaders. It's animated in our debates over health care. The Affordable Care Act is still unpopular among the majority of white people. Support for the Affordable Care Act has never gone over 50% among white people. The anti-government conservative ethos that holds the conservative and moderate wings of our politics together really still has a racialized narrative around who belongs and who deserves. That is what holds it together.
And yet more white people would benefit from the Affordable Care Act than black people in raw numbers, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. The majority of the uninsured are white people. I, talked to folks in Texas where they refuse to expand Medicaid, where, the rural hospital system is absolutely being decimated. You had this devastating story of a toddler who choked and her parents couldn't get to a hospital in time because their local county hospital had closed. And I talked to a, white rural guy who said it's this gut level rejection of Medicaid and Obamacare and all that it represents. And yet, of course, it's the majority of white people who are going without.
You write about the subprime lending practices in the 1990s that, in some ways ultimately led to the 2008 financial crash. And there was a narrative here that, these were subprime mortgages, cheap mortgages being pushed on people who probably shouldn't be buying homes. And these were irresponsible borrowers making bad decisions. You looked at this and found it's a pretty different story, didn't you?
That's right. In fact, leading up to the crisis, the majority of subprime and therefore more expensive loans were A, going to people who had credit scores that would have enabled them to get prime or cheaper loans, and B, weren't for new homeowners. They were existing homeowners being aggressively marketed refinance loans that often ended up stripping equity and ending up in foreclosure. And the first targets for these kinds of toxic loans were Black homeowners.
Right. I remember this. This was described as predatory lending by a lot of activists in the 1990s, and they asked the regulators, you need to do something about this. What happened?
The experience of being one of the ignored and unheeded and outmatched few who were trying to raise the alarm about this really forever shapes my understanding of economic policy. What happened was, in many ways, these regulators and these lenders, there was a lot of greed, right? People were making money hand over fist. If you could get someone to pay 9% on a six-figure loan versus 5%, that basically doubles your money. That's huge. But it was also a little bit of racism too, right? This age-old stereotype about Black people being risky, not being good with money. It's a tidy justification for denying Black people the opportunity to make money. And so it was a lot of greed, obviously, but it was also a lot of racism.
A lot of these people are essentially hustled, talked into these complicated mortgages. Many of them are foreclosed upon. And then, of course, the mortgages get rebundled into these complicated securities that are sold on Wall Street. One of the things that contributed to this huge crash in 2008. And, of course, the irony here is that a racially targeted marketing campaign, which takes advantage of African-American people, when the crash comes, what's the effect on working and middle-class white people?
It was devastation. When the crash finally came, everybody felt the pain. There were 8 million jobs lost, nearly $19 trillion in lost household wealth. In many ways, so many families that lost property value and houses still haven't recovered from the Great Recession. This is one of the most costly examples of racism ultimately costing everyone.
One of the things you write was that this had an enormous impact on the family assets of African-American families. You said this shrank the wealth of median African-American families by more than half between 2005 and 2009. That is an astonishing number.
Yeah, this is the chapter that is closest to my heart, that I get the most emotional about. I share a story of going to Cleveland in 2007 and taking a walk with some community activists who were showing how nearly every home on the street in the neighborhood of Mount Pleasant was no longer in the hands of the rightful owners, had been the victim of subprime mortgage refinances and then foreclosure. And I remember so vividly just being totally overcome with just the weight of the history of it all. To really see Black people who finally got their shot at the American dream that was denied so systematically for so long. People who, so many of these were, elderly Black folks who had finally been able to buy a house. And, think about like their parents and grandparents in many instances had been, subject to Jim Crow or even were enslaved people. And this machine of racism and greed had just sort of mowed down the neighborhood. And I remember running around the corner, excusing myself, and then just falling to my knees and sobbing, because it just felt like, why are we so doomed to repeat these mistakes again? And, I had that moment in 2007. And then, of course, a year later, I'm actually in law school, and I see Lehman Brothers is going into bankruptcy, right? The company on Wall Street that had invested the most in mortgage-backed securities right at the end of the bubble. And it wasn't until I was writing this book that I learned that Lehman Brothers, the original brothers Lehman, were slaveholders who made their money in the Confederacy, running cotton behind the cotton blockade during the war and setting up the cotton stock exchange, and just how tied up it all is.
Heather McGhee, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Dave. It's great.
Heather McGhee is the past president of the progressive think tank Demos. She currently chairs the board of the online racial justice organization Color of Change. Her new book is The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together.